Dawn clung to the gravel at Bad Aibling like a damp bandage, cold enough to make breath show. Lisa Hartman kept her eyes on the wire because it felt safer than looking at the Americans. Somewhere beyond the fence, a small engine coughed, hesitated, and caught. A thin tongue of flame licked from a priming cup, then settled into a steady roar. She didn't know the machine's name, range, field, M1937, but she knew the language it spoke, heat that meant food. The air turned suddenly round and generous. Bacon rendered to a shine, a crack, then another, eggs, many, striking a hot plate. Lisa's stomach betrayed her with a noise she used to mock in others. Sergeant Joe Delaney had the line set by 0500 because the book said 0500, and that was reason enough. Gasoline cans stacked inboard, fire extinguisher on the ground, griddle plates scrubbed until they flashed in the pale light. He checked his roster, 2 men on eggs, 1 on bacon, 1 on coffee, 1 on flapjacks, as needed. No cold corners, he told them, meaning keep the heat even, keep the flow. He'd managed a diner on State Street. This was the same, only the customers wore olive drab and the audience beyond the wire wore defeat. Lieutenant Leon Rail Mendoza signed for last night's load off a CCKW that had arrived blacked out and on time. He touched each crate like he was blessing it: flour, pork, evaporated milk, coffee, sugar. Then the smaller things that made a morning humane: salt, greaseproof paper, a chalk stub to mark portions. The driver reported a stubborn carburetor at kilometre 12. Mendoza nodded and made a note to rotate trucks before failure. Redundancy wasn't romance, but it saved breakfasts and battles both. An MP detail moved the women, Wehrmachtshelferinnen, signals and clerks by the look, toward a processing tent. The corporal at the entrance spoke German shaped by Kansas wheat, polite but unbending. Names were taken, watches surrendered, questions asked about units and posts. Lisa answered as drilled, then failed to keep from inhaling when a pan was tipped and the smell rolled like church bells. It wasn't greed. It was memory returning. Sundays before the sirens, a mother's skillet, a kitchen with nothing to fear. Delaney cracked another tray of eggs and listened to the M1937's steady breath. He liked that sound. It meant systems were working, depot to rail to truck to burner to plate. He lifted a spatula the way a conductor lifts a baton, tested the griddle's edge for heat and called, "Coffee up." Lisa closed her eyes and let the aroma pass through the wire. The war, she thought, might have ended last week on paper, but here it ended with a sizzle. Ink stained the edges of the 8x10 forms until the stack looked bruised. Inside the canvas tent, the air was wet with wool and expectant silence. Lisa stood before a folding table while a 7th Army clerk tightened his grip on a fountain pen and asked for name, birth date, last posting. She said, Wehrmachtsnachrichtenhelferin, signals helper, the syllables clicking like relay points in her mouth. He wrote signals, female, and underlined it, then stamped acknowledged with the weary authority of a man who had turned chaos into columns for too long to be impressed. Outside, Delaney briefed his mess team like a squad leader. Egg run starts at 0500, coffee taps at 0515, flapjacks as dictated by flow. Keep your lanes, watch the grease tin. He tapped the galvanized can that would catch the liquid gold he refused to waste. Bacon fat was flavor tomorrow. He had no patience for carelessness. The enemy had taught him that discipline mattered most when no one was watching. The M1937 threw steady heat. He adjusted the air shutter a quarter turn because the flame's tone had shifted half a note. Mendoza set a sheet of butcher paper on a crate and drew a map of their morning. Depot A fed rail spur west. Spur west fed truck column 2. Column 2 had 3 trucks and a spare. The spare shadowed the column 2 kilometres back with orders to replace the first vehicle that hiccuped. On another line he sketched a second path, Depot B to spur south to column 5. If weather or sabotage cut one route, and it still happened, breakfast would not miss time. He penciled in figures because numbers quieted rooms. Burn rate of gasoline per hour per range, flour consumed per 100 men, coffee per head. "Margin is a weapon," he said to the junior lieutenant who hovered. "We carry it like ammunition." A chaplain passed through the processing tent with a Red Cross nurse, checking on water and order. Geneva wasn't a suggestion, it was doctrine, and Delaney's ledger served it. The nurse asked the clerk to add a note: "Distribute hot drinks to the women's enclosure after the line." The clerk nodded and wrote it down. When Lise's form was complete, the clerk tore off the top sheet, handed it to an MP, and slid the carbon copy onto a neat pile that had become, in a few hours, a kind of peace. She stepped back into morning light. Bacon lifted a new hymn from the griddle. Somewhere behind her, a stamp fell again, heavy as a gavel, setting a routine that would hold. The farmhouse sat low against the earth, as if it had learned humility from winters, its whitewash gone grey where rain worried it. Therese Aigner drew water from the pump and watched a pencil of smoke rise beyond the hedgerow, thin at first, then persuaded by a small wind into a flag that said, "Breakfast." She knew the smell before it found her, fat on hot iron, sugar in coffee waking up. In 1918, the only smell she remembered at dawn was worry. This one felt like order arriving on time. A jeep rattled up her rutted lane with 2 MPS aboard. The corporal took off his helmet as he asked for water and nodded toward the new camp. "Good fences make good neighbours," his smile said, and she understood the transaction. She filled their can with well water and watched how carefully they set the lid, not one drop spared. It struck her that Americans treated small things as if they were large, and that might be why their large things were impossible. She had heard the rumours: women captured near Bad Aibling, clerks and telephone girls, put behind wire under American guard. The priest said not to stare, not to forget who lost and who won. She didn't intend to forget. But hunger had a way of making politics petty. She poured the remaining dipper into her own cup, sipped, and let herself think what she was thinking. It was mercy to feed those who could no longer harm you. By mid-morning, a work detail would typically pass her field on its way to clear wind-blown branches and repair a fence line. If it came, she would likely set aside a few eggs, 2, maybe 3, and some boiled potatoes. Not charity. Settlement for quiet. She had a son somewhere under rubble and a husband with lungs like wet paper from the factory. Grief had taught her to prefer systems to speeches. The Americans seemed to run on systems. Even the way the little kitchen smoked felt scheduled. At the hedgerow, she paused and closed her eyes. The breeze brought the clatter of tin, the faint call and response of a mess sergeant keeping time. It would have been easy to call it arrogance, the way the smell crossed property, the way conquerors cross borders. But there was something plainly domestic about it. No brass bands, no banners, only a stove that worked, and men who showed up on the minute. She rinsed the bucket and set it upside down on the step. "We feed them right. They work right," her mother would have said, unsentimental as a ledger. Therese watched the smoke and decided to bake bread this afternoon. If order was catching, she meant to catch it. The line began as a rumour and became a road, bodies finding their places with the certainty that comes from repetition. Delaney ran his crew like a conductor. 2 men on eggs, 1 on bacon, 1 on coffee, 1 floating. He set the griddle to sing at a single pitch. The M1937's burner responded to an 8th turn of the needle valve, the flame deepening from ragged to confident. He broke eggs one-handed. Tap, split, spill, tap, split, spill. Each yolk settling like a sun cupped by steel. "Keep the lanes clean," he murmured, sliding a scraper across the surface so the next cycle met a fair world. An MP explained to the women the rules of the line as if reciting liturgy. "Mess tin forward, no talk until served, step aside after receipt." It was less about control than velocity. Velocity kept meals hot and tempers calm. Lisa felt the old training twitch under her skin, signals, discipline, timing, clarity, now repurposed to navigate a foreign order. She watched coffee pour, not slopped, but measured. She watched bacon lifted with tongs and let herself imagine taste. Her awe was private and a little ashamed. Behind the kitchen, a Red Cross nurse checked temperatures with a mercury thermometer and logged them on a clipboard. Safe milk, safe water, safe coffee. Nothing improvisational. Mendoza, in passing, pointed out the fuel consumption figures. How many gallons per hour the range drank, how many pounds of flour translated to how many pancakes per 100, how Geneva's requirement for equivalence to depot troops turned into arithmetic any corporal could track. Doctrine isn't words, he said, more to himself than to the nurse. It's the math you do when no one's looking. Lisa received a ladle's depth of something hot and a square of bread. She did not expect bacon. She did not ask. The shock was simpler, the steadiness of it all, the way the sound of a ladle knocking tin became a bell to start a day that promised nothing but routine. She felt something in her body unclench, fear metabolized by calories. She registered the guilt and then the fact that she was human enough not to care. Delaney watched the line's tail. He never wanted to see it stall. He cracked 2 more trays of eggs, tipped them to where the heat ran hottest, and kept his men talking low. You could smell a mess line go wrong before you saw it. Panic had a scent. Today smelled like breakfast and rain. He smiled into the steam and called for coffee to roll. The Kansas letter smelled of pencil and handling, the way paper learns a voice if carried often enough. It began, "Dear Mother," in the tidy script of a man trying to prove he could be trusted. Ernst Becker had been a prisoner on a wheat crew in 1944. He wrote about a farm kitchen where a woman with flour on her elbows served pancakes that steamed and bacon that shone, and eggs so fresh they stood up in the pan. "I do not know what to say except that these people are punctual," he wrote, which was how a German paid transcendental compliments. He meant, they make time behave. The letter intercut itself with the morning at Bad Aibling as if 2 films had agreed to share frames. Lisa heard the word pancakes in translation and felt the ground tilt. She had believed America was glitz, not governance. The letter said otherwise. Delaney skimmed a copy, chuckled at the observation about punctuality, and taped it to the side of the flour crate as a reminder. When your enemy admires your schedule, you are halfway to peace. Mendoza used the letter as a teaching sheet. He traced lines with a pencil. The standard kit that fed Kansas, M1937 range, 20-quart stock pots, griddle plates, gasoline cans, ladles, was the same kit that fed Bavaria. A field kitchen that could plate hundreds of eggs in an hour in one hemisphere could do the same in another because the parts matched and the training matched and the numbers never lied. "Standardization is a bridge," he said. "We built it across oceans before we stepped on it." He wrote figures beneath the letter because the numbers were their own kind of prose. In 1944, American red meat production exceeded £25 billion. Egg output surged with it. While armies marched, packing plants and railroads and feed mills at home performed a second campaign so omnipresent it went unnoticed. The impossible part wasn't that the United States fed itself. It was that it fed an army, allies and prisoners without losing the beat. Lisa held the translation page and felt that private shame again, envy braided with relief. She did not bless the victors. She blessed their competence. She imagined, not for the first time, what this steadiness might have done if it had come to her country in time. The griddle hissed its single note and the letter went quiet in her hands. Delaney refilled the coffee urn and patted the paper taped to the crate. "Different farm," he said. "Same skillet." Interrogations in May were less about secrets and more about sorting. The young interpreter asked questions in a voice that had learned German in a Nebraska kitchen, soft around the consonants, but sure enough. Lise answered as taught, unit, station, duties, dates. When he asked what she had been told about Americans, the propaganda unscrolled itself before she could stop it. Decadence, disorder, a people drunk on novelty. She didn't believe it anymore, not since the first morning, but the words had muscle memory. The interpreter set the pencil down, considered, and pushed across the table a single-page ledger Delaney kept for visitors. It was not theatre, it was the day's truth. Coffee issued per head, bread by loaf and weight, fuel drawn by the M1937, logged to the 10th of a gallon. Grease captured in a tin for reuse, breakage rates for cups and plates. A small note in the margin. Hand off leftovers to Red Cross for enclosure, 0600. Lisa stared at the tidy columns. She had seen artillery tables, wire diagrams, maps with coiled arrows. She had never seen mercy graphed. Outside, Delaney ran the scraper across the griddle so it sang. He would have told any visitor that waste was not a sin, but a failure of planning, and planning was the war. He pointed with his spatula to the spare cans lined up behind the fire extinguishers. If fuel delivery failed, the reserve would carry the kitchen through breakfast cycles without a hiccup. Inside the tent, Mendoza described, almost absently, how the quartermaster's two-rote policy meant a single enemy cut wouldn't silence a stove. "We don't do single points of failure," he said. "Not for radios, not for rail, not for eggs." Then came a statistic that should have been impossible, and yet sat on the page as calmly as flour dust. By the peak month, the United States held roughly 371,000 German POWs on its own soil, spread across more than 500 camps, and fewer than 1% attempted escape, 2,222 in all, numbers so stable they read like weather. Lisa did the math as a signals girl would. Stability follows credibility, credibility follows routine, routine follows breakfast served on time. The interpreter didn't argue. He pushed the ledger back and folded his hands. "You will be processed and moved," he said. "It will be orderly." She believed him because coffee arrived when the ledger said coffee would arrive, and because bacon did not lie. The tent flap opened, the scent of the griddle entered like a verdict. Lisa felt her throat work. She did not surrender to a flag or a speech. She surrendered to the arithmetic of warmth. Night came down like a blackout curtain, and somewhere on the service road a CCKW coughed itself into silence. The driver hit the choke, cursed softly, and lifted the hood into the wet Bavarian dark. Delaney felt the gap like a missed beat in a marching band. He didn't look up from the griddle. The M1937 held its pitch, eggs pooling obediently to the heat. "Float to bacon," he told his spare hand, a small adjustment that kept the whole line true. The rule was simple: never let the tail of the line see your worry. Panic bred hunger, and hunger bred trouble. Mendoza stepped out with a flashlight, tracing a cone down the road until it struck the stalled truck. The spare column rolled forward as if tugged by a wire he'd strung yesterday. He didn't run. Logistics doesn't run. He arrived breathing evenly, checked fuel, spark, carburetor, laid a hand on the block to feel warmth where warmth should be. The gasket he'd warned about 2 days prior had gone soft. He slid a replacement from a tin and worked by touch, the way a man learns to tie knots in the dark by sailing through bad weather. Behind him, the kitchen kept its beat. Coffee taps at 0515 was not up for negotiation. Sunrise was already obliging them by greying the camp's edges. Delaney's scraper sang along the griddle's lip, making a clean lane for bacon to land. The smell had power enough to cross wire, hedgerow, memory. Lisa stood with the other women and did the arithmetic she could not unlearn. If the stove never goes cold, the story you were taught about the enemy falls apart at the corners. She watched Americans fix a truck without theatrics and hold a schedule without shouting, and some internal gear began to mesh with a new set of teeth. The spare truck slid into place, tailgate dropped, crates shouldered. The stalled rig sputtered awake on the third try, not triumphant so much as compliant. Mendoza made a note on his clipboard and looked back toward the kitchen. The discipline of the line, the even flame, the way bacon hit steel at the exact moment coffee lifted its own steam. These were performances of doctrine he trusted more than speeches. When the first ladle met the first mess tin, Delaney didn't smile, but his shoulders came down a fraction. The point had not been breakfast. The point had been that breakfast would happen anyway. Lies felt the proof arrive on time and found herself breathing to the rhythm of a stove she did not own. Afternoon laid itself across Therese Eigner's fields, gold broken by shadow where the hedges learned to lean. The work detail came along the ruts with that slouched efficiency prisoners use when they know pretending to be slow helps no one. An MP walked them, baton tucked, posture easy but precise. Lisa carried fence staples in a tin and felt the odd relief of instructions she could accomplish. Clear the fallen branch, set the post, pull the wire hand tight until it sang. The land answered effort with clarity in a way headquarters had not for years. Therese had set a pot on the back of her stove and a griddle on the front, habit and intention kissing like cousins. She did not plan a feast. She planned order, the kind that sweetens the bitter taste of surrender. 2 eggs per worker, if chickens complied, and potatoes browned in bacon fat, saved in a jar, because her mother had survived wars by refusing to pour away calories. She kept a cup of coffee aside for the MP, because courtesy is grease for any machine. Delaney had cut the kitchen loose to evening maintenance and came out to the lane to check on sanitation and demeanour. He watched how the canteen lids were replaced, how the prisoners washed hands at the pump, how the MP's shadow fell polite and long. He had seen lines break for less. Today the air was steady. He tipped his cap to Eigner when the coffee cup changed hands with the small ceremony of neighbours policing their own boundaries. Danke, the MP said with Kansas vowels, and she nodded to the uniform, not the man, because names would complicate good sense. The skillet announced itself when the first potato crisped, the note rising as if the pan had found its key. Lisa inhaled and let the day's math settle. The calories spent digging post holes returned as heat on the tongue, the nervous system reaffirmed by salt and protein. She ate quietly, eyes dropped not from shame but from concentration, as if flavour required focus. A soldier handed her a spoonful more with a glance to the MP, who looked away in a decision masquerading as indifference. Therese remembered a winter when a neighbour's boy had come to the door with hollow eyes and pride he could not afford. She had fed him then. Feeding now did not mean forgetting. It meant surviving together in a corridor of time where war had ended but peace had yet to invent itself. When the detail shouldered tools and the MP tapped his baton against his palm twice, the agreed signal, she lifted a hand. "Morgan," she said. The promise was simple. Work done, food fair, no lies. Inside the quartermaster tent, night had the colour of pencil lead. Chalkboards flanked a folding table, columns neat enough to comfort a surgeon. Mendoza tapped the butt of his pencil where the day's ledger ran. Pork issued by crate and weight, flour by sack, coffee by tin, fuel by gallon, water by barrel, bread by loaf. His junior officer had come in hot with a list of failures from elsewhere. Bridges collapsed, lines disrupted, a rumour of sabotage, and Mendoza let the words fall until they lost their heat. Then he circled 2 figures as if they were coordinates. "Here," he said, "is how we bend disaster until it behaves." He pointed to throughputs that seemed like jokes told by optimists. A single rail spur moved enough ration weight before noon to keep multiple field kitchens singing into evening. Truck columns staggered by 30 minutes prevented bottlenecks where roads narrowed. Reserve stock sat 3 kilometres back with orders explicit enough to survive a dull interpreter. None of it sparkled. It worked. He added a second line in firm numbers. The system had absorbed a truck failure at 0410 and delivered coffee at 0515 anyway. When the junior officer frowned, Mendoza stepped back to the map and told a story in statistics designed to shock humility into the conversation. During the peak month, the United States had managed more than 500 POW camps on its own soil, sustaining roughly 371,000 German prisoners with escapes at under 1%, a stability that dictated posture at every fence line in Bavaria. That, he said, tapping the chalkboard where tonnage met headcount, is the shape of an army that wins before the trumpet. The numbers were not triumphal. They were plumbing diagrams for mercy. He laid the chalk down and reminded the room that doctrine lived in margins. A two-route policy was not abstract. It meant a stove stayed hot when a bridge went missing. Standardization wasn't fashion. It meant a spare part scavenged from one truck fit another at midnight during sleet. Geneva Convention requirements could have been ink. Instead, they were coffee measured per head because ledger entries become habits and habits become reputation. Delaney stuck his head in, grease under his nails, and asked for confirmation on flour replenishment. On the quarter hour, Mendoza answered without checking. The answer matched a schedule he had written last week and would write again tomorrow. Lisa's name wasn't on any board, but her morning would arrive on time because a pencil had already said so. The junior officer looked at the boards and knew he had been arguing weather to a clockmaker. Mendoza smiled, thin as a stencil. "Post tomorrow's plan," he said. "Victory has a curfew." The briefing room borrowed light from two hissing lanterns and authority from a typewriter that had outlived 3 campaigns. Occupation staff filed in with damp coats and notebooks, the rustle of paper louder than talk. Mendoza stood beside an easel and lifted the muslin cover from a chart no one would call beautiful, only necessary. He did not begin with adjectives. He began with numbers, because numbers went home in pockets, not arguments. He walked them through the arithmetic that underwrote the morning ritual nobody outside the wire had seen as strategy. American meat output in 1944 had topped £25 billion. Egg production surged alongside it, and a force of roughly 12 million underarms had eaten on time while allies were supplied and prisoners were fed in compliance with law. He drew a line from national scale to company stove, a field range burning gasoline at a predictable rate, griddle plates cut to standardized dimensions, coffee tins that matched ladles to yield a known number of cups. "We made mercy measurably," he said, not as rhetoric but as summary. Delaney added the texture that makes figures trustable to hands. He spoke about breakage rates and how teaching a private to set tinware quiet saved more cups than any reprimand, about grease capture and how a gallon of rendered fat across a week meant flavour tomorrow and efficiency always, about temperature logs, a nurse's frown at a lukewarm urn, the way discipline smells like nothing and thus passes unnoticed. He watched heads nod when the accumulation of petty care coalesced into power. Questions came. What about sabotage? What about shortages? What if rail failed? Mendoza answered with the same indifference he brought to a broken bolt. Redundancy, reserves, second routes, the habit of writing plans long before they would be needed. He gestured toward a sidebar that made several throats clear at once. More than 500 POW camps sustained, hundreds of thousands processed stateside with escapes counted in the low thousands, behaviour shaped by a reputation that meals arrived when Ledger said they would. A civil affairs officer in a British greatcoat asked the only question that carried smoke. To what end? Mendoza looked at the chart until the lantern hiss filled the room. To pacify the morning, he said. When breakfast is punctual, the rest of the day consents to be reasonable. That is how we move rail cars without guards on every yard. Pens went down in unison, that sound of consensus made manifest. Delaney thought of his men washing the griddle and logging fuel to the 10th, modest heroics that never met a headline. The lanterns hissed again, and the room understood. Fairness on a plate was a weapon in a holster, and America had learned to carry it safely. Rain stitched the morning shut and then forgot to knot it, a fine drizzle that made tin roofs speak softly. Lisa sat on a bench under an awning and wrote a letter she knew would not travel, the page a place to put air so it would not bruise her ribs. She listed small things because the big ones toppled if you touched them, how the burner coughed twice before catching, how the coffee line curved like a river finds its own bed, how the American with the spatula kept time with his heel as if music were an obligation. She wrote the word bacon and stopped, not for shame, but for accuracy. The smell felt like someone had returned a missing key. A nurse came by with a chocolate bar scored for sharing, the squares snapping like brittle decisions. "Save the last for later," she said, English softening her consonants. Liesa did the arithmetic in reverse. A square now meant a steadier hand when the ledger called her name, and steadiness built a bridge from morning to night. She did not love the nurse for offering it. She loved the system that made offering it possible at all. An MP read names from a clipboard for the next phase: processing, interviews, transport. The rhythm of order worked on the mind the way a metronome works on hands, training them to play in time. Lisa watched the chalk marks on the board where head counts were reconciled, saw numbers erased and rewritten without drama, a bookkeeper's ballet whose grace lay in indifference to applause. She recognized herself in the posture of the clerk, the old signals discipline, timing, clarity, now in the service of undoing a war. Therese Aigner arrived at the fence with a basket fitted to circumstance, eggs wrapped against breakage, bread still thinking about heat, a note that said nothing at all because paper did not need to carry sympathy to carry sense. The Red Cross volunteer accepted it with the ceremonial brevity that keeps favour from looking like favouritism. Lisa saw the handoff and felt something hard in her soften a measure further. Systems had faces, it turned out, and some of them were lined by weather and grief. When her name was called, she folded the unsent letter and slid it into her coat pocket as if saving a receipt for a debt already paid. The stove exhaled its familiar breath, the smell reaching her where the wire could not. She stood, shoulders squaring not in defiance but in accommodation to a day that would proceed by numbers she now believed. The rain slackened and left the camp damp but legible. Dawn returned with the arrogance of a fact, and the burner obliged it with the practiced cough of a machine that trusted its own history. Therese watched from her gate as trucks idled softer than they had last week, men learning to treat engines like partners, not beasts. The basket she carried felt lighter than the day before because decisions, once made, stop weighing as much. She lifted it to the Red Cross volunteer and caught Lisa's eye only long enough to nod. The transaction felt like 3 signatures on a treaty: giver, receiver, witness. Delaney set the griddle to level with a carpenter's instinct and reached for the scraper he had used so many mornings it knew his hand. He logged fuel to the 10th, grease to the pint, flour to the pound, and pinned tomorrow's plan where a tired corporal could not miss it at 0230. It never felt like victory to him, this bookkeeping of flame and fat. But he had learned that wars end at scales and ledgers as finally as they end at flags. He cracked eggs with the care of a man setting charges and watched yolks hold. Mendoza signed the convoy schedule, trucks assigned by condition and temperament, not rank. He did not permit single points of failure into his mornings. It was a superstition backed by policy. The chalkboard behind him showed head counts, stepping down in neat escalators. One enclosure processed, another in queue, a third staged by rail. When a runner mentioned a rumour that a bridge west had lost a span, he didn't look up. Route 2 was already written. The rumour arrived late to a meeting he'd held yesterday. Lise climbed onto a truck bed with others from her enclosure, the wood cold but not cruel under her hands. She counted breaths to keep time with the kitchen, inhaling when the spatula clicked, exhaling when the ladle rang tin. She understood now that sound could be a guarantee. She touched the folded letter in her pocket, not to mourn words unsent, but to honour a truth learned by a nose before it reached her mind. Abundance made disciplined had defeated ideology set to parade step. The impossible number hovered unsaid over every movement, a nation that could field roughly 12 million underarms while sustaining allies, feeding prisoners, and still producing enough to make mercy feel routine. If a single morning could carry that math on its back, a stove that stayed lit, a truck that arrived, a woman who smelled breakfast through wire, then the rest of the century might too. Engines rumbled to a reasonable chorus. The burner's breath steadied. The griddle hissed, exact and unremarkable, the sound of a republic keeping its promises.